All right.
We'll just wait for her to come in. There we go. And there. I'm there. Okay, there you are. She's in there. Do you see her?
She's gonna go out there.
She's going to be coming up shortly.
There we go.
Yay!
Hey, welcome, Gina.
Thank you, guys. I
Maybe
think maybe I wasn't meant to be there today.
Okay, I'm gonna call to order this committee of the whole meeting. Number 242 for April 18th, and in honor of the Leewat of the village of Pemberton acknowledges that we are meeting within the unceded territory of the Leewat Nation. Following council members are attending in person, myself, Councillor Laura Ramsden and Councillor Ted Craddock. Joining us remotely are Councillors Katrina Nightingale and Councillor Jenny Helmer. For those members of the public in attendance, please note that this meeting is a live webinar and is being recorded. A recording of the meeting will be available on the village's website following the meeting. Any amendments to the agenda? Seeing none, moved as presented. Councillor Craddock, seconded by Councillor Ramsden. Any opposed? Motion carries. Adoption of minutes from committee of the whole 241 from March 28th, moved by Councillor Ramsden, seconded by Councillor Craddock. Any opposed? Motion carries. So we go right to 4.1, the 2023 draft information review. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you for having me today. Those delays weren't as a result of overwhelming subscriptions like Netflix on the weekend. Here's the budget. We've met quite a few times already, and today bring everyone together to we're going to present to everyone some reserve and tax implications of the operating budget for 2023 and the 5-year plan. Specifically, just so kind of the intent and outcomes are made clear, and those that are following our report can see the recommendation at the end. We are looking for any changes or recommendations to amend the operating budget or 5-year plan, any other input from council, along with today we'll conduct a review of the reserves, proposed recommendations, and I'll look for some direction with the proposed tax changes, increases that would inform the next steps of the budget, which will involve setting some rates and getting those approved before May 15th. As I've been doing this year, I just wanted to remind everyone of some of the budget principles that staff has been considering when developing the budget with your input, and looking at service, cost efficiency, and accountability. And the themes which inform that include really promoting organizational health, smart growth, emergency preparedness, looking after the environment, service excellence with focus on or consideration for reconciliation, regional transit, and flood mitigation. And those all are with an effort to deliver service to make Pemberton a healthy, safe, and beautiful community. I'll jump right into it. As we've been chatting about, but I want to consolidate and highlight today, as I did in my report, there are a number of pressures to the budget which have informed some of the recommendations that we'll speak to later in the presentation today. Continue to experience and forecast to see continued pressure in terms of the increase on price of goods and services. That's especially the case in consumables and contract labor. A lot of tactics in place to mitigate a lot of these factors, but that one in particular. There's been an increased pressure on support for aging infrastructure as our as villages infrastructure ages. we continue to see increased demand to support sustaining the longevity, maintaining it, and embedded in the budget. I will remind everyone there's been two major recent water main failures just up the street from where we're sitting today that highlight some of that risk from some of the older infrastructure. Again, as we've talked about quite a bit, we've seen a lot of turnover in the last number of years, and the budget that we're proposing endeavor to mitigate a lot of the expenses that are associated with that increased turnover while promoting a cost-effective and middle-of-the-market approach to staff retention. And that's as a result of the compensation review and recommendations. Those assumptions are all embedded in the budget. We've continued to see road infrastructure, which is not kept up with the ideal plan, and we've seen some areas that need some attention. And through our road maintenance budget here, we highlight that requirement. And similarly, the longer term view of funding some of the budget, it just hasn't kept pace with what's been needed to stay on top of that. Historically, there's been an underfunding of reserves, and I can get to that when we look at a few of the reserve assumptions and put some recommendations that align with some of the findings from our consultant that your city brought forward on January 31st of this year. I'd highlight two that we did see a very significant drop in the development revenue year over year. So 2 years ago, we did see $704,000 of revenue come in, and we saw nearly a $300,000 decrease year over year, which was $160,000 off of budget. So we saw a very quick shift in that revenue. There are limited alternate revenue streams, so we are largely reliant on tax collected primarily through Class 1 or homes, duplexes, townhouses, condos. That is a large proportion of the collections. We have seen also that there's been a higher than typical pressure around some of our legal expenses, and a lot of those come through engagement with some airport stakeholders. So material variance there with some tactics to reduce that going forward. And then additionally, I'd highlight that there is a decreasing reserve balance in some of our one-time funding, namely the COVID-19 reserves. So we're very fortunate to receive some funding and a number of years ago. However, implication of that is when those funds are depleted in a couple of years through targeted investment and in support of our budget, we would likely see tax increases support similar service, meaning it just delays some of the pressure of very low tax rates. I kept the list to one page, but there's a number of other factors that I just wanted to highlight some of the key pressures that we are seeing. Since when we last spoke and now, we received the revised rule from BC Assessment, and we've incorporated that into the budget. We had completed a role previously, not a material change, but we do see a overall 24.85% change in assessment value, with 7.22% of that from non-market change. So approximately $163,000 of non-market change this year. And BC Assessment, just as a little bit of commentary, they provide this every year. It's an independent assessment of the value of all of our property classes. We incorporate that into the review of our taxes and preparation of our mill rates. Number of factors for this change as well. But there is the non-market change and the market change assessment. My note says here, pause for laughter. So to set the foundation of some of our discussion today, how does Pemberton stack up amongst the other municipalities in BC? Pemberton has the 5th lowest rate in 2022 of the 161 BC municipalities. I wouldn't celebrate that, because it means with some of the pressures that we identified that there are some significant pressures going forward. I think what we'll discuss today is the need to explore some of those the mitigation tactics to help support maintaining assets and supporting the future growth. But in my opinion and recommendation to council, being very low, we are starting to see even more pressure. And in preparing for today and reviewing all the recommendations to council as well, it's been a recurring theme that some of the reserves are underfunded, and that supporting maintenance of our assets, keeping a healthy infrastructure and looking forward to growth, that it's been quite unsustainable. So I'd really like that point to resonate today as everyone's thinking, and please ask questions, help explore that too. I just wanted to start with that today. And Pemberton's not alone. This is quite typical of most municipalities underfunding reserves and perhaps not planning enough for the future. And what we have seen this year in particular is a lot of these pressures have prompted a lot of places to take action. As an example, as you can look at this list here, proposed or approved increases are approaching double digits or exceeding. We see our neighbors in Whistler with an 8.4% property tax increase, Squamish at 5.9%, Low at 5.7%, but Vancouver 10.7%, Surrey 12.5%. We're seeing these as higher than typical increases, but again, lots of pressures this year. So I want to take a little bit of a forward-looking view, but to start, I'll just talk about what happens if we don't look at changing increases or thinking about this differently. Again, being one of the lowest rates in BC. So if they continue to get deferred, where at some point to balance a budget, it becomes entirely unsustainable. You can result in a depletion of reserves, completely reducing or eliminating the contingencies for very bad scenarios or large expenses, which would be unexpected. There can be a requirement to significantly increase future tax rates much quicker than a steady and ratable planned approach. You can also result in reducing service levels and cutting amenities and services if that approach continued. And the proposals that we'll talk about will simply, from an assumption standpoint, will simply allow for a continuation of services. So as we've been talking about service level objectives and what the community's feedback has been and the direction we've received and worked with council around maintaining that same service level, snow being cleared, grass being cut at existing levels, development permits processed at a similar rate. This proposal assumes that we would keep that service level steady. And embedded in the 5-year plan, Appendix D of your agenda package, we do have some assumptions which I would recommend shift from a shorter term perspective. Very low increases at 2% or below, maintaining some of the reserve objectives and promoting healthy assets, stable service levels. And importantly, I'd highlight a couple of points that stood out when reviewing this. There are future pressures included in this 5-year plan that include the addition of and incorporation of new infrastructure. So the daycare expansion in order to support the ownership and long-term maintenance of the asset. There's an incremental cost for maintenance and operations, similar to some of our other new infrastructure, public works and parks. As infrastructure ages, we tend to see a higher rate of cost to support it, especially as it begins to fail towards its end of life. That with inflationary or cost pressures tends to become more expensive over time. Reserve requirement pressures as we support making our assets healthy and some of the growth, the addition of new assets. This is cognizant of that increased requirement. Simply the capital plan with some significant demand, namely, as we discussed a few sessions ago, the demand for infrastructure with the fire hall, municipal hall, some of the other large water and sewer requirements coming up. Those are embedded in the assumptions here as well. And that's all trying to balance future borrowing as well. And in addition to these kind of pressures, with funding supported through the gas tax and the one-time COVID-19 funding, there is a decreasing balance in those funds. So it is challenging to predict precisely what sort of future provincial or federal funding we may be fortunate enough to receive, apply for, pursue, so forth. But in terms of our current roster, the assumptions rely on these funds, and particularly with the COVID-19 reserve, it supplements some one-time operational costs that we've been thoughtful to smooth out so we don't see an immediate impact when kind of weaning out of these funds. But again, they just delay some of the pressure to the operational budget as well. And I would highlight, it's not quite as gloomy as it might be outside today, but there is a little bit of offset and favorable offsets from the Growing Communities Fund. But though we'll discuss that a little more after this budget session, there is a significant demand on some of the infrastructure priorities, and I wouldn't, between the restrictions on the fund and again some of the critical infrastructure demands, I wouldn't bank on that to offset these other pressures. And I'd highlight again the proposals included in this 5-year plan, simply maintain service levels while accounting for some of the growth that we've already discussed.
I think I would just through the chair, if I could just expound upon that too. And I think council priorities around climate action and things of that nature. You know, at this juncture, this current budget doesn't see the space to be able to start to, I guess, add to the organization in a way that would enable us to build those priorities out. Thank you.
This story translated to numbers kind of looks like this. Any questions?
Anybody have a question or?
I'll wait till last, if that's okay.
I wanted to talk a little bit about reserve balances and those following along Appendix B. I've covered off the end of year 2022 unaudited preliminary figures there. So they don't necessarily incorporate all of the implications of the capital plan. Again, it's end of year balances for reference. So it is critical to continue to fund reserves for the forward-looking view of maintaining healthy assets, especially with a lot of that increased demand with the aging infrastructure. We are seeing significant growth in assets in Pemberton, a lot of new development and the introduction of some new assets really have future pressure of operations and maintenance. Those requirements really drive the need for planning for the future. I think we need to be doing that today. I think we're really fortunate to be successful in the grant, whereby we hired more city consultants, and Brian Paul did a wonderful job at thoroughly reviewing our asset ledger with us and providing some professional, like some perspective and advice with years of experience operating in municipalities. And I really loved something that they presented back then to us, and it really resonated. And that is this: they'd highlighted that the perspective, and it was observed in Pemberton, was that there was a real drive to keep taxes low. They observed that in our history and in our relatively low reserve balances across a number of categories. And their recommendation was to shift that mindset to keep assets healthy while considering affordability.
Through the chair, and if I may, one of the things I appreciated brings this perspective back to the table, and being reminded of this quote is this does reflect a lot of what we're hearing in terms of the OCP engagement and concerns around keeping infrastructure strong in the community as the community grows.
So I'll jump into what it looks like if reserve balances are underfunded. It's a potential scenario, but I think it's an illustrative example. It really is important to remind council that if we don't continue to invest in our infrastructure and as it grows, we can end up in a position where we are underfunded. And I don't think that's going to happen overnight. The recommendation that we did receive from our consultants is that we do this over time. A typical recommendation to similarly situated municipalities, but it is gradual, and you do have to build it over time to get to where we need to be. And recommended scenarios that we've incorporated look at a 15-year duration to do that, and that reduces our risk and exposure to major impacts to our taxpayers, but allows us to maintain our infrastructure. One of the limits, however, is as we grow, as we increase our asset base, we need to do a little bit more. So assumptions that we're given, we're assuming like for like with the existing assets. And as council knows, we're adding some pretty significant assets coming up, a daycare, some amenity buildings, and there's some fire infrastructure as well. And these are all things which will continue to create a case for this increased investment in reserves. Assume everyone's taken some time to review this, but I'll get into a few of our specific recommendations. But the recommendations that you will see if you look towards the bottom third of the report will revolve around some targeted attention around the general reserves, the capital reserves, and the sewer reserves, which are at this point underfunded. Water is generally quite healthy, and fire will have some work to do, but given the arrangement and partnerships in place, that's also an area that we're looking to increase over time. I did speak a little bit about the community works gas tax funds as well as the COVID restart funds, and there are a number of deferred projects which we spoke about, nearly $700,000 of gas works funding, and we're awaiting some assumptions around some federal grants that might shift around that project priority. But to tie the link back to our capital plan, about nearly 700,000 of that would be recommended and dedicated, along with approximately $250,000 of COVID funding in this year's budget. Before we get into the operating and capital funds, I just want to highlight the utilities funds and provide a couple of recommended reserve assumptions there or recommendations. And just to kind of ground the discussion here, utilities, the sewer and the water, this is the infrastructure, the systems that allow us to provide safe and reliable and effective delivery of water and sewer services. And they're funded separately than through general taxation. So through the user rates, they have a different funding model than the tax implications we're talking about otherwise. And in working with your city and in fact before that, and for years as we looked at last year as well, sewer has a larger gap, it's been identified. And the long-term recommendation is to grow that reserve contribution to support building that out over time. And there are annual contributions allocated, water 324 and sewer 200. That was up from 160 the year before. And as I mentioned earlier, it would seem water is reasonably funded. My recommendation would be to increase the sewer contribution up to 240,000 from 200, which would be as a result of a little bit of surplus. So around capital and operations, again, targeting that we grow those reserves and gradually increase it over time. What I'd like to bring forward for consideration is the recommendation to increase capital reserve. So as you think about that, that covers a whole host of future capital investments from drainage to roads and equipment. We think about funding some of our long-term capital plan, using that as well to supplement some of our grants. And I also recommend that we increase the operational reserve, again, shorter than or smaller than we'd like to see at present. And that can support funding future operating liabilities, future maintenance and operations, rolling in new pressures to the budget that are coming up, including those kind of beyond our 5-year plan as well. And I believe that that's going to support the longer term health of the organization. And the scenarios, which I'll highlight on the next slide, give an order of magnitude. I recommend that we look at increasing each of these, both capital and also operational, each from $61,000 to $102,000. This is where we would be looking at a tax implication. This would be the increase of tax. I'll show that a different way on this next slide and then pause for questions. So, thinking there's a few. So the scenarios that I highlight in the roads, we see capital, drainage, road equipment, operational. Below that, and the total tax impact below. The scenarios I've outlined here would be a 7% tax increase, 8% tax increase, 9%, 10%. So to ground that and provide some perspective, at the Village of Pemberton in the 2023 budget, the impact of a 1% tax increase is only, not only I should say the other way, it's huge for Pemberton, it's $20,580. So we do have a very small operating budget. It's very sensitive to pressures and changes, and this is why it's so critical to be thinking about setting aside and dedicating reserves for the future. And I'll before I come back to this, I just want to show a few illustrative examples so that you can kind of ground that in what it might look like as an impact to a typical home. So say, just pick one, say someone lives on Laburnum in a $1.128 million house based on 2023 assessments. The impact of 8% increase might be about $91. So that would be the way you would read this chart, and that's the order of magnitude of these increases. And the other point I would highlight, which is an uncertainty at this point in the budget, what we're talking about today is the collection to fund the budget for the Village of Pemberton operations, and this isn't collection on behalf of other entities, school and regional district. We don't have all of that data. We haven't received all of that yet, so we're not precisely sure what those impacts are as we think about the pie and what we're collecting on behalf of other organizations. But for the Village of Pemberton share here, we're looking at, I'd recommend we look at these type of scenarios, and I would also highlight that based on what we see with the revised role with BC assessment, it would be hard to provide a blanket statement as to what an individual property's tax implications might be, as it's tied to the value of that individual tax roll or that property based on BC assessment data. And for context as well, last year, council did approve and support a 5% tax increase that was dedicated to capital and operational reserves. And this would be, in my opinion, one of these scenarios, a continuation of that appropriate growth of reserves to fund future operations. I've been talking a lot, so I get some off you. Please take some feedback.
Let's start with questions. Before we get into comments. Questions, comments?
This might be a very silly or simple question, but I was just, it was about how exactly how reserves work. So I understand, we're putting money into reserves, and then it's the idea then that for larger projects down, we would draw on those funds to pay for that project and then slowly build that back up over time. Okay.
Just give me a quick history on the COVID restart funds. I thought a lot of that money was also for health purposes, so outdoor type of situations, but I see in your write-up, which I appreciate, it's mostly going towards administrative costs, bylaws, telephones, that type of thing. So you're saying you're drawing it down again this year substantially. So at what point do we look at other aspects of what that money was to be used for, or could be used for, to do some outside project?
Yeah, I think we have been looking at all of those scenarios. I think in concept, when it rolled out, I have to imagine where we were at that time. And there was uncertainty of the impacts of COVID-19 from a health and safety standpoint to a collection standpoint. There's a whole host of criteria which were eligible for that funding, including revenue shortfalls. At that time, we wouldn't have been sure if everyone could pay their taxes. Unfortunately, most did. PPE, proper, the safety equipment, some of the resources required to have people working in alternate arrangements. Those were all part of the plans that would have been rolled out to council as well. So as we've looked at where some of that funding has been used and as is eligible per the grant, what has been proposed, I think, has been considerate of longer term implications of organizational planning as well, meaning some of the specific investment to create better workstations, more reliable IT resources, things that were impacted largely from COVID-19, in my opinion, will result in shorter to mid-term operational efficiencies and savings that will allow us to be in a better position than we have not had that funding. It created a catalyst to do some planning and think about how to be impactful or create a bit of a return on investment with that funding. I think in terms of some of the projects and other categories, I think it has been used to support some of those as well. Some of the one-time reviews and And work with contractors, I think, has been considered as well. So that said, these would probably be routine or operational costs that would be borne or perhaps prioritized, if not deferred, on an annual basis as well.
So I see Councillor Hummer, I'm just gonna follow this question up if I could. So a lot of those funds, as you mentioned, are used towards IT and people working remotely and some of our, I think some of our emergency IT as well.
That's right.
Those spends came to council.
Yeah, they would have been approved in the budget and we'd highlight through our budget process a lot of those areas, yes.
I just, I mean, it's been going on for a little while, and I just wanted to refresh my own memory, what was sort of delegated authority to spending those funds and what was reviewed by council. And I remember not all of them, quite honestly. I do remember, you know, again, some of the IT, especially in the emergency related, but those expenses came through us.
Yeah.
You want to follow it up?
Well, yeah, I guess, yes, they did. And now we're into the third year beyond COVID. COVID's finished, and that's nice to see that this year we're expensing just by your sheets, $112,000 in this year's budget. So I guess I'm continuing to look at it and see, okay, if we've approved this in the past, great. But at what point are we just going to run this fund out without maybe putting some into some external things that are healthy for the community? I mean, this is healthy for the environment, for the staff. And it seems to me we're paying some bills that shouldn't be coming out of it, but I'm not completely aware of it because the COVID funds and its limitations. I don't think council's ever spent a bunch of time looking at it in the committee of the whole or anything. So that's all I'm trying to figure out is that fund just going to be used over a period of time for these type of things without other considerations?
I guess my question would be, to help me understand how to better answer whether we'd be looking to dedicate some of that funding to other priorities that we've previously reviewed. And if that is the case, I think that aligns with my point here that if we do go pursue other additional requests with this funding, we're going to have a more imminent tax impact immediately to support some of the operational requirements that have been used with this fund. I'm not sure that I kind of follow the question necessarily. We may want to explore this further to make sure I do.
I guess it's no different than the time you get a one-time grant. Oh, I'm sorry, can I continue? Yeah, a one-time grant for certain purposes. And it seems to eventually just keep decreasing without some of what you initially thought it was going to be used for. It was going to be used for. And yes, taxation has to pay for the ongoing cost of the administration. I agree with that. And if we have to pay for money out of a one-time grant instead of taxation, then that should have been picked up in the last 2 or 3 years. And I just agree that money shouldn't have been used for that purposes, and it should have been done through taxation. I don't recall us discussing that in the last couple of years, so that's why I'm bringing it up.
I mean, through the chair, I'm not sure that I can comment on the exact state of COVID in the discussion, but from what I can gather from the records that I was reviewing and preparing in the approved budget, these would have been approved through council. There would have been discrete decisions around some of the staffing approvals that are dedicated the majority of this funding. So I think my recommendation is we do consider how we transition out of some of these funds, but and create a sustainable operating budget where there won't be appreciable tax increases to fund operations that were subsidized through these grants. But I'm confident that they would have been approved by council at the inception of the grant.
Yes.
About that, if we're good for now, we'll go to Councillor Hummer.
Thank you. And Tom, thanks for the fulsome presentation. It's interesting to read it all. I think I just have a bit of I'm more of a curiosity piece, and I feel like it's something that comes up within the community a lot, is the 1% tax increase equaling to that 20,580 number. And I feel like, although I might be misremembering, that it wasn't that long ago that a 1% equaled to a $30,000 tax increase. Am I remembering correctly?
No, I think when I first came on, it was like closer to 11. Yeah.
11,000.
Yeah, last year was just over $19,000. And
Yeah, it was like 17 something.
Okay, so how does what's the history there behind a 1% tax increase resulting in more or less money per 1%? And you can keep it high level. I'm just, obviously I went in the other direction than what was accurate, but if it was 11,000 and now it's 20,580, is that because there's more taxpayers added, or is that from something else?
It's the increase to the assessment, to our whole assessment, so through market and non-market change. So it's the increase in amount of taxpayers and in value.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Is that that was a layman's answer? Did you want to fix that?
That works.
Go ahead, Councillor Ramsey.
So, sorry, these may be some basic questions, but just to clarify. So when we're talking about non-market change, is that we're talking about just the number of essentially new taxpayers or new properties that have been added into the tax base?
Yeah, that would represent the majority of the changes. If there's a zoning or a property or a class change, there's a few factors that support that as well, but most of that's new development. Somebody builds a new house, it's added, and that house might pay another $2,000 in taxes, and that's added to the non-market change value.
Market change is the increase in value.
Yeah, house went from $1 million to $1.2 million. We collect a little bit lower rate. We add a couple of points or a fraction of a point here to the mill rate to support potential tax increases, and then we collect on that.
So I guess that would be my follow-up question then is, so if we have a combination non-market and market changes, so, you know, the total base, you know, the properties from which we're collecting go from, I can't remember what the numbers are, but simple math, let's say it goes from 40 million to 50 million. Actually, sorry, that's for example, if you have a house that increases in value, when we're talking about these property tax increase, I'm just trying to figure out how it works for somebody. So if my house has gone from being 1 million to now 1.5 million, and that would mean if we had used the previous year's tax rate, I'd be paying additional tax. And so if we increase the mill rate, are we then saying, okay, well, you're not only increasing, it's on top of that increase I'm already seeing just from the increase in the assessed value of my house?
Not necessarily. So you would we would set a new rate that allows what we did last year to fund the budget. So in the example you shared, I'm quite confident we could say we would see the rate go down. And then any changes to that, any potential tax increases would allow us to increase that a little bit. But with the kind of example that you shared, with that large market change, we may not see a rate as high as we collected last year. So that rate, which you see on your tax notice, that mill rate per 1,000, you would multiply that by the value of your house, the 1.5 million, and arrive at your new tax bill.
Okay.
Here's another way to look at it too. So if your house went up the same as the average home in Pemberton, and so when, let's say everybody in Pemberton, just pick some really round numbers, everybody's homes went up 5%. And we didn't raise our taxes at all, but your property went up 5%, just like everybody else's. Zero change. Even though your property went up 5% value, it doesn't impact your taxes at that point.
You'd still be paying the same amount of tax. Your mill rate would go down. Okay.
But the dollar, so now here's the other part of this now. If your house went up more than the average market, because let's say you live in a townhouse and townhouses really spiked this year compared to the rest of the market, and we didn't raise taxes, you're going to be paying a little more, even though we didn't raise it. If you're below that average,
You
then
might actually drop.
you might actually go down a little bit.
Okay,
And that's a really, I mean, that's such a hard one to explain to people because people assume, a lot of people assume. My property went up 10% this year and taxes went up X, add that together and that's gonna be my increase. You know what I mean? Like, that's where a lot of people's math
yeah,
takes them, but we're related in the way Thomas just explained.
yeah, no, and thank you for that, that was confusing me a lot before, I know I've got
And
it.
that's why the last chart, I think it's one before, I can't see it. The homes, like a $1.2 million home with an 8.4 increase, or what did you quote, an 8% increase was 90?
The Laburnum house or the Laburnum
Yeah,
duplex, and I suggested if we saw 8% tax increase, that'd be worth about $91.
And that's factoring in 8% and the mortgage.
yeah,
More questions? Okay, and so you're good. So we can now, let's talk about comments. How do you feel about how we want to approach this? We've got some taxation scenarios, dollar figures. Open the floor to comments. Right?
I guess there's three things that I'm looking at that. The questions have come up in past meetings, but we haven't received information on it to go forward. And the three things I've would like to talk about is potential RCMP costs and reserves. I've been looking online to see what the average is, and I guess the reason I'm asking that is we're at 3,600 people in town here now, I believe. Or we went up 32% last year. Even if we see only a 20% increase for the next 2 years, we reach 5,000 people. And then we've got 2 years to catch up to pay for it. So sure, it's nice to hear that the government is looking at it, but I don't hold much hope out for that. I'd like to hold out hope. So when I look at that and look at the average that they put online for the costs, we'd easily be looking at somewhere around $600,000 to $800,000, which could be the first year of the next council. So I would still like to talk about that and see some numbers just to see if some of this reserve should maybe go towards that. That was one thing. The second thing I noticed in here, we're waiting for a report back from our consultants regarding council remuneration and where that's going to be. I thought we were going to have it at the last meeting, but it's going to be in the committee of the whole or council meeting because it's public. And I haven't seen that yet. So I see in our governmental, there's no extra money allocated in case there is an increase there. So I was wondering about that. And then the other discussion that we haven't had, and I certainly would like to take a look at, is the provincial 2.2 million funds that we are going to receive by the end of this month. And how we can allocate that either towards taxes or any number of areas or reserves. So those are the three areas that I still need some comfort before I can go forward.
Yeah, let's break those down one at a time. I think a lot of those are, you're looking at Thomas, I feel a lot of those are conversations for council committee. But let's go one question at a time, or one thought at a time. So actually, hopefully this one's one of the easier ones. What about the governance remuneration?
I would highlight, we did include the last motion from council to incorporate, but we do not have direction from council to seek third-party remuneration reviews. So that's not part of current scope. I believe we could.
Excuse me, yes, we did. Through the mayor, he did ask for that to be done by the consultants.
We did ask that to be connected to the consultants.
And we still haven't got that, so I'm waiting for that review. We did it right here in the council.
Apparently, the resolution that we have says though at year 3.
No, we asked.
Well,
for
we talked about setting up a pattern where there's two things. We talked about setting up a bookmark for what you just talked about in year 3, having a really big review of council remuneration so that it's done on schedule. But we did also ask that as part of the WCDC, whatever, review, that they look at other, and I asked the consultant that too, when he was on screen, if that was forthcoming.
Do we have a resolution to that effect?
Okay, it might not have been a resolution, and I guess we should have been a resolution, but it was definitely talked about at least 2, if not 3 times, in terms of just attaching it. Like from the very beginning, I asked the question, will this be looked at as part of the review, like before we even got into it? And during the review, there was a question whether or not it would be coming back to us. And I asked the consultant. So I don't know where that puts us now. We're in a budget place, but
I guess the question for there is, if we did want to pursue that, is that's, I'd like to include that in the budget for 2023, because we have an opportunity to do that. I would highlight. Probably want to get a cost estimate, understand, but it's very public information as well, so probably a lot easier to retrieve and at a lower cost than some of the market data for the other positions. And I believe there was some work done last year reviewing the BC landscape and relative pay as well.
We presented a whole report last year in February, and it would be easy to update that from last year and give an overview of what compensation packages are provided to councils, and that would be done.
which would be helpful,
Very
and we can
easy.
bring that back. And again, we asked for it in the context of WCBC, whatever, because of the way they chose the comparable communities. So there was communities of our size, there was assessments of our size, there was our corridor and neighbors to be considered. That's why we wanted to, as opposed to what we've done in the past, which is pick 5 communities and try so.
Well, if I may, the list that WCBC used came from the comparison study that we did last February.
Okay, well, as long as it's got this, similar thought process, that's why we were interested in paralleling the process, because as long as the thought process is the same, then that's fine. I mean, I don't, so this budget doesn't include any increase to governance?
It does include,
It's 8%.
I believe it was CPI this year, and that was based on the motion that we last received, which we tracked. So that would.
Remuneration bylaw.
Yeah.
Based on CPI.
So I don't know how we wanna, we can go with what we have, which is that CPI increase right now, or as part of the budget consideration right now, or we can park that and bring it back at the next budget session and see if we want to make an increase that way. Those are, I think, are 2 options.
I think whatever direction council would like to take, I think we're in a position at the moment to adjust that. And my apologies if I got confused over the 3-year resolution versus the WCBC piece. I think the important part is that we have the mechanics in place now to do this, and we have the collective data in terms of the community groups that we're going to assess ourselves against.
So do we park this to the next budget session and include it as part of our pushing ourselves?
When you say next budget session, are you talking the next meeting next week or 2 weeks or whenever, Heather?
We're getting really tight on schedule. We'll have to schedule a special committee of the whole to be able to facilitate another budget session at this point. The bylaws need to come forward on the 9th of May.
Yeah, well, how about we just park it for a few minutes here, go through the rest of the conversation and see how we then want to incorporate it back in.
No, that's fine.
For the RCMP, I mean, I agree with Councillor Craddock's concerns around this, always have, and we've been working towards this in a number of ways. I think your math is a little bit off when you calculated 32%. That's 32% over 5 years was that growth. So we won't be over. We do have till the next census and then 2 years beyond. So we have a good 5, not that that's a ton of time.
That's why I said 4 to 6 years.
So we
Still blows up.
So we do have a few years, but
Yeah.
not a ton of time, and it is going to be a hugely significant cost when it does hit. So I think my question, I don't know if it's a question for the group and for yourself who brought it up. We're looking at our budget. I'm personally very appreciative of staff bringing forward a very lean operating budget. We're looking at our increases going all to reserves, pretty much, like our tax increase, we're looking at the full, let's say we're, just for the sake of argument, let's say 8% right now. That full 8% would go towards 100% reserves. So I'm very appreciative that we could actually have a budget brought forward that allows all the reserves to, or all the increases to go to reserves and not towards increased operations. And I just want to point out, I think that's a real tribute to staff. A lot of organizations, a lot of municipalities have across the board went CPI and then as a starting point. So 6% increase, right in line with CPI, and then carrying on with increased costs and pressures and swelling the budget from there. We didn't do that. Our staff didn't do that. And it's allowed us to come to a point where I think we're very fortunate to look at our full increase being towards reserves. So my point is, Councillor Craddock and the rest of the table, you know, we're looking, if we look at what's suggested here, an 8% allows for an $82,000 increase to reserves in both capital and operational. If we wanted to do our CMP, would it not be on top of that? Is the question. Like it's one of two things. It's either, let's say, sticking with the 8% example, we go with 8%, and of that $164,000 increase, some of that goes towards our CMP, or are you suggesting we're looking at in addition to this?
I'm looking at when the final number we come up with has enough money in it, whether it's 10% or 6% plus the top up, that there will be a reasonable amount of money put towards the RCMP.
Is this, I mean, these reserves
There's
are
nothing
fairly,
in there.
well, no, not first, I mean, they're fairly general.
Yeah.
So we're building a general reserve to a certain degree, just as much as we feel our taxpayers can afford.
Right.
So it sounds to me like already the conversation on is how much of a reserve do we want to build? And then how is it allocated? So right now, this is a very general reserve. So I just kind of want to point that context out. But it's
Yeah, I might highlight that the operational reserve might be a very appropriate area to look at that increase, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend restricting it to RCMP, but with the view that the operational pressures coming into the future that have more imminent needs, the daycare coming on, which will carry maintenance expenses. There's other pressures, but the idea is that that does support that type of forward-looking cost, and as we continue to assess and understand our starting point, which is policing costs, which are collected at $288,000 already. The transition, though abrupt when a municipality crosses that 5,000, does provide a bit of a transition period. But if we're solely collecting for RCMP in today's dollars, they'll be worth less in the future, and also just defer some of the pressure just a little bit further down the road. So I might suggest that if purposing or the intent is to grow that operational reserve, that fund, that it may be appropriate not to restrict it necessarily, but it is in view of supporting those type of scenarios too.
and then maybe not locking them in, as you say, but considering them like RCMP and capital infrastructure and all that, knowing that keeping it general, so it allows some flexibility depending on what we need to do as in the immediate. But I guess the fundamental question here is, do the reserves we're looking at, are we coming up with a number to build reserves that we feel comfortable with to cover infrastructure, to cover RCMP, or not to cover, but to start building towards covering that? Like, so what the total number is we're looking to learn.
And as a reminder as well, the end of year general reserve balance is $520,000. There's going to be significant pressures coming up with, as I said, some of the asset growth and so forth. So tying up some dollars for something that may be 5 or 6 or 7 years out, perhaps it is sooner, but the current figures which our development team does have do put that growth above 5,000 outside of 5 years from now. I might suggest there are more imminent priorities with an underfunded general reserve at present, but again, just wanted to highlight those couple of numbers.
Actually, you said exactly what I wanted to say in terms of, I guess, a major concern that we would want to take into account is the fact that even if, you know, this is operational, even if we do have a certain number of funds set aside to offset that first year in, we're still going to be in a position where that Band-Aid will have to be ripped off at some point within the following years or consecutive years, because then the entire cost will be borne by the village.
The other, I suppose, question or opportunity and like create more work for us as staff, but I would remind council that we have engagement with the RCMP. Council has gone to UBCM to discuss this with other communities, but I think there may be an opportunity to continue to pursue a plan that will incorporate this at an appropriate time with a better figure in future as well. What we were not able to receive from the RCMP when staff did meet with them was a specific budget or a total cost estimate. So given it is beyond their planning cycle, we were not able to get budget numbers for what this might cost. So it would be challenging to predict what 6 or 7 years out the actual demand is. And certainly I'm appreciative of the forward-looking view here. I just want to say it's a moving target, which we are planning for other forward-looking challenges with this general reserve.
At this point, go ahead.
Yeah, and what I did, I went online and it lists all the communities, all the costs for the RCMP. It was a 2020 report brought by the provincial government. And at that time, it was roughly 120,000 per officer, plus detachment and public employees. So, you know, it just all of a sudden concerned me because I think we have 5 staff. So multiply that out, it's about $750,000 when you include detachment and other staff. So that's what concerns me. It's not going to be our council that's going to be hit with that, but it could be the next council almost for sure. And I don't want to leave them with looking back and say, well, why didn't we use it?
I think the concern is well, Liz, Councillor, I think at this point, and at this point, and next year, I might say something differently, but at this point, we don't need to know quite what the number is. What we need to do is start preparing and forward thinking forward towards it. But, so yeah, we'll refine that. We'll get a better understanding what those costs will look like. But in the meantime, the main driving point here is we need to consider these future costs coming and how do we start preparing for it. Councillor Helmer, sorry, I missed you.
No worries. I just, around the RCMP piece, I feel like it's such a big discussion and I wonder if there's, you know, down the road when there's capacity, if we get it onto our strategic plan, because, you know, there's a lot of questions around who's paying for it, what's the process? Like there's probably lots of blind spots that we do have to it. And maybe it's not, as you've just said, you know, exactly germane to today's discussion, but it certainly will become so. And maybe just setting that piece in motion where we begin to identify all of the components to it and start to build out a strategic plan for it, as opposed to trying to figure it out today.
Totally agree. And that will be coming back as we work with the RCMP. So 100%. Councillor Mango.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation, Thomas. One of my concerns is public transit, regional transit. Talk about a Band-Aid being ripped off. And I'm just wondering, looking at things like the COVID Restart Grant or any of these other, if there's any potential for us to even contribute a small amount in terms of even a pilot project to do something towards changing what's happening with regional transit now and helping the people of our community get to work in a more cost-effective way. Transit was one of the priority themes of this budget, and I feel like I'd like to see if we could do something to start to address the issue. So I'm just putting that out on the table.
Thanks for bringing that up. Feel equally strongly about transit. I don't know if this provides a bit of an answer, but you know, we're currently, the regional transit committee is currently working at a rapid pace with the provincial government on a pilot project, right? It's still very much in the early stages of being developed, so I don't have a lot to say about it now. The hope was that this pilot project to connect Pemberton to at least Squamish, if not all the way to Vancouver, will be in place near the end of 2023 is sort of one of the hopes, but I don't know if we'll get there. But my point being, this pilot that we've agreed to working on with the province, we don't know what the costs, if at this point, if or what costs will be to the local governments or the municipalities with this proposed pilot. As you know, the partnership has gone to the province a number of times to try to present different funding models, especially one with a fuel tax, which was rejected initially, although there's some interest in it now, it seems. But the partners have gone and said, you know, we need to refine the funding and the governance models, and we don't have those details. We don't know what the province is thinking in terms of our funding proportions or funding scheme from all the municipalities. So I don't know what we can put ahead, like I don't know when that system will be in place and what we can put, you know, what we're going to be required to put up, if anything, towards that. With regards to our current local service that goes to Whistler and local as well, as we saw in our recent presentation from BC Transit, we have to order, you know, we're looking at some of those short-term solutions that Thomas and staff have been working on with BC Transit to get a little bit more buses on the road. In terms of adding buses, that's something we have to commit to 1.5 to 2 years prior to it happening. And one of the difficulties is that the provincial government did not increase any, did not put any spending in the budget to increase local transit systems. So in other words, their proportion that they pay to all the municipalities for all of our transit, right, the 53 to 47 split, the 53% that they pay to a municipality like ours to help support our transit, if we want to add buses or increase the service at this point, they do not have funds to match that. So I don't know, I think I said that in a really unclear way, but my point is, if we said right now we want to add 2 buses, right now we're paying for the whole pot because they haven't put any.
Yeah, no, I totally recognize that, and not looking for something so grand. I'm just looking, it's sort of, what I really appreciate about what Thomas is attempting to achieve with this budget is to be very proactive and long-term and look ahead, and even talking about all the reserves, like that's what we're doing. And I feel we need to apply that same thinking to regional transit. We're not going to we can't get buses immediately. I recognize all of that. But is there anything as a council or that we can do, even if it's a small amount, to let the village, the people of the village know that, yeah, we're paying attention and we know it's expensive for you to get to work, and some of you can't get to work on time, but we're actually going to do, even if it's a 2-month pilot project for the summer or for anything, for kids to be able to get back and forth to Whistler in the summer, anything, just to show that we're trying to take steps to make change to regional transit. Because if we rely on our federal and provincial partners, we're going to be sitting here for a long time. And I that may sound harsh, but you know, we've been waiting and waiting. And I'm just wondering, like something like the COVID restart grant, that was for operational impacts, and there was a lot of lost revenue during COVID. To transit. And is there any way we could even take some of that money for the grade 10 class for July and August to have free bus passes, something like that?
I'm not sure how to answer. Sorry. You know, I did, you know, there was a transit committee meeting I could speak to a little bit later, but and we did talk about high school passes and pilots and that sort of thing. I mean, the complicating factor is any initiative that you're proposing requires either buy-in from our partners or full funding from the village. So right now, as we know, we're in a position where Area CPSLRD is reducing the funding they are putting into the system. which is increasing the pressure on the village and on Leeward Nation to pay for transit. So I'm not sure how I would want to suggest to approach this. I certainly appreciate and respect your intentions here, because I feel strongly about it as well. I'm just not sure how we go about doing that. Building a small reserve for transit. Again, we have two partners, and I don't know how it works. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Thomas, navigating that.
I think there's a lot that the committee is looking at, and I'd probably be a little bit out of school to share my idea, but I think as it's been highlighted, seeking funding solutions that are sustainable, more forward-looking, and develop a system that's integrated and beyond a short-term pilot, I think are critical, and short-term reserves, the cost of adding buses, I think any attempt or endeavor we might make to do something in the short term, I think requires that larger cooperation. So I don't have any immediate recommendations, no.
And then, there's there's more to fill in and maybe discuss in camera as well in terms of some of the.
Okay, yeah. No, I just appreciate, how do I say it? It's, I mean, Elizabeth said it, ripping the Band-Aid off, like at some point, I recognize that there's a cost to everything, but at some point, we need to do something more. And I feel, based on my conversations, I don't have them in writing, but my conversations with people in the village, a lot of people would welcome, even if it costs them a little bit more, knowing that they can get on public transit at a lesser cost and get to work or wherever they need to be. And I would appreciate having a deeper conversation around it and seeing if there's any creative way we can come up with anything to add to this budget or shift in this budget to address the regional transit issue.
Okay, and again, I'm not trying to work around you, I'm trying to work with you here, but I'm just struggling a little bit because there's so many moving parts to that. Again, we have two partners, so any funds that we put towards that, if we all agreed 100% with that sentiment right now and said, let's put X amount of dollars towards transit, we would be at this point effectively funding something on our own without our partners. So we would be funding it for all of the service. If we said we're going to do a pilot for X, we would be funding that on our own. So to move ahead and increase service and all that, not unfortunately, we have partners and we got to work through with them and not just the government's, the funding bit as well. So like I say, Area C is reducing their contribution. So if we want to do anything, any initiative that you're proposing that with a dollar tag attached to it, either our partners are on board and sharing that account, or we're funding that for the whole valley, which is something we would need to consider. I got you, Laura. So I'm just, again, I'm just not sure how to proceed. I want to bring and I did bring some of your thoughts forward to the committee meeting the other day, because, after our conversation. So I'm just struggling to figure out how to move this forward. I think backing up one statement, I agree with you in the Band-Aid ripping off thing. I think, I made the statement earlier that everything we're looking at for tax increase is going towards reserves. And I think we could all, with the concerns we have collectively here at council, we could suggest 5 really important reserves we need to build. 1 for transit, 1 for RCMP, 1 for asset management. We have a lot of upcoming costs and pressures that we're trying to manage. And I agree, we need to start ripping the Band-Aid off now instead of really harshing in a few years.
Yeah.
All that money is going towards reserve. I don't think we need to get so prescriptive right now that we say we're putting, let's say, $200,000 in reserves this year. 10% of that should be transit, 10% of that should be RCMP, 20 should be for whatever. I think we need to build our reserves for all of these things that we're trying to tackle in the future. And we have these ongoing conversations that you're bringing up in terms of how, I don't think it's a budget conversation right now, Katrina, I guess is what
Okay.
I'm saying. I don't know how to move it forward in the budget context right now. I think the big picture, big question for us here today is what kind of taxes do we want to start looking at putting on this budget? And recognizing that those increases all go to reserves. We can keep having these conversations in the next few weeks and months, just similar to the RCMP question. And I'm not trying to stall, I just don't think we could move an initiative forward now with the budget, with our partners for transit.
Yeah, I think that what prompted me to ask it was because of the COVID restart grant, which was for operational impacts. And Ted brought that up and there was obviously, a lot of lost, there was no ridership during COVID. So if there's any way, we could be creative with that and do something, anything to start ripping that Band-Aid off, then I think that would be great.
And we did talk about transit from COVID funds early on, but then the province actually gave money towards transit recovery. So most municipalities went, okay, we're not spending any of our COVID restart funds on transit because there was separate money given or put back into transit from the BC government. So our transit system did get a boost outside of the COVID start funds, just so you know, like all municipalities did.
Right. Okay.
Patient Laura, go ahead.
So this is a bit of a raggedy thought, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but just spitballing there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Councillor Nightingale, but it sounds like potentially what you're saying is, or one way we do it is say, could we earmark, take $10,000 or $15,000 out of the COVID restart fund, earmark it as just something for transit, even though we don't have the specifics, and then have that $15,000 that we could maybe look at. Because obviously we don't have the data in front of us, we're not going to be able to make any decisions. Said it's really difficult, but if that is a message that we wanted to pass along to the community, maybe it's something like we take $10,000, an additional $10,000 out of the COVID restart fund, earmark it for transit, and say, okay, we're going to over the next couple of months see if there's some sort of initiative that we could fund, like providing, reduced bus passes for students or something like that. We don't have to do it if it doesn't make sense, but at least, I don't know.
That's all. I think that's all outside the budget process here today. I don't think that's what we're here to look at today is our budget and our tax implications and what we're going to set in motion now. If we want to look at, if we want to look at in a few weeks, have a better conversation about how we can move transit forward and work with our partners to do that, and then pull some money out of the COVID funds that exist. But it changes nothing up here.
Okay, so we could, because right now, if I understand it in the budget, we have some line items saying that we're going to cover it. We're taking some funds out of the COVID restart fund already. Correct. Yeah. So there's nothing stopping us from, let's say, 6 months down the road, if we do come up with some sort of project, let's say it's around transit, saying we could use, again, just throwing out numbers here, $10,000 from that.
Or even our general reserve that we're building. And that's my point, is we have all these things that we want to build or protect. If Thomas's suggestion is, how big a reserve do we want to how much do we want to put towards that big reserve now? How much can the community afford to put into reserves right now? If we wanted to start talking about how we piece it out 5 years down the road for RCMP, this year for a transit initiative, our reserves are there to draw on if we need them.
I guess going to share some napkin math as well, just to create some context around what we would be looking at in terms of, as an example, if we were to initiate something like a student pass for 10 months out of the year. Put this in perspective, our share of the transit partnership right now, Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, it's about 131,000, our share of transit.
Our contribution?
Our contribution, so
Yeah, I'd have to look at that.
Yeah, I think it's about that. The challenge with this is if we're looking at, say, like 10 months of service for all secondary school students, as an example, the spitball cost of that would likely be around $200,000. So I think, you know, as we're having further conversations around this and considering this, I just hope that helps us to develop some relative perspective around what the costs would look like to implement an amazing pilot project like that. Certainly the impacts would be huge, but you know, how we fund it definitely there'd have to be some major considerations around that.
Yeah, I would highlight too, having freshly looked at some of the transit ridership data too, that we probably would want to look at the larger implication. I think nearly 50% of ridership was commuters going to work. There's just over 3% of the student population that's riding. So there's probably a lot to bring forward. The other point that I think might answer one of the immediate budget questions that kind of supplements this is we did hear very loud and clear from the community that, and we saw the lineups, people stood in them, some people around this table as well. And BC Transit within this budget has been able to introduce some additional service by way of utilization of the deadhead buses. So the local bus, the smaller of the two buses, it was previously doing a dead haul back and forth to Whistler. No one was in it, and they were able to introduce that. So we're just finalizing and formalizing that added schedule with no incremental cost. I believe it's 6 minutes round trip addition. So there's some things that are very short term, and I completely agree the long term view is critical. But embedded in the budget, we do have some assumptions that add 26 extra seats on the way to hopefully support some of those commuters and students and others. But it is only a shorter term impact, and as Mayor Richmond noted, that 1.5 year to 2 year plan to add those extra routes, that is something that requires planning, and for council's awareness, that is not currently in the 5-year plan. That wasn't added as an assumption. I think that's something that needs to be discussed and added in future, certainly based on some of these discussions, but just so everyone's clear that is the way it's reflected, just so you see the translation to the budget at present.
You good on that? Then you still have your hand up, Councilor Nangle, you good on that for now?
Yeah, thank you. It's going to require a deeper conversation, and I just want to, yeah, Councillor Ramsden, thank you for trying to clarify that, because I recognize that, yeah, that COVID restart, it's not going to, it wasn't about adding additional funds, it was about shifting. So as long as we can have that conversation at some point about potential creative solutions they are short term, but they're also shifting a behavior change. And I think that in the long term is a start that is something that we have to consider, because even if it's a 2-month thing, it's actually shifting behavior, and we have to start somewhere. So, yeah.
I missed one of your 3.
Oh, the last one was the discussion regarding the 2.2 million potential.
Right. So the funds are, and which I guess question for the group. So we have the $2 million from the growth fund. I know there, you know, that's something we haven't really looked at. There's some, I think we've all spent it 4 times in our heads. Staff have ideas and et cetera, but you know, I think our approach up to now, so my question for the group, our approach up to now is to sort of consider that outside the budget. In other words, that's a one-time thing that's going to help us support maybe some projects and some investment in infrastructure, or reducing borrowing on some of the big projects coming. But I don't know, sort of the approach up to now was to not really consider it too much in terms of those numbers. We want to build a budget that is self-sustaining year over year and not dependent on a one-time fund, as we've talked about before. So I definitely want to talk about the $2 million too, but I'm wondering if that's outside of this as well.
I certainly hope not, because we got $2.2 million and
$2 million, but yeah,
wasn't it 2.2?
$2,020,000.
Okay, so
$2,000.
well, we're gonna get to 2 somehow.
Yeah, okay, 2 million.
But I certainly think we're just the caretakers of the taxpayers' funds. And how we spend them, I think, is important. So when we look at the taxation numbers here, when we look at a lower percentage cost to the community by adding a few dollars from that fund that belongs to the taxpayer. So I'm looking at that period, and I know when we brought it up one time, we started to talk about it, and like you said, everybody had ideas. That conversation was stopped and said, we'll deal with it another time. I'm waiting for that other time, and I think it should be a part of the budget discussion. And I'm hoping when we finally get to a priority session, that this would be part of it. But I believe that it's council's requirement to take a look at that and see if we need something. There's money there.
So my question is, I mean, I agree, we're caretakers of the town's money and I take it equally seriously, just to be clear. I think that when we stopped the conversation last time, it was because we said, well, it's kind of outside budget. Part of the thinking in my mind was, and again, I'd like to hear from the rest of council on this as well, was that if we use money from that to keep our taxation lower, the jump in a few years will be that much higher. If we want to talk about building reserves, we're trying to build something that works year over year over year. So if we lower our taxes this year or lower our tax increase this year because we're using a one-time fund, then next year we'll have to make a more significant increase, and it's going to sound like 16% rather than 8%. Whereas we can use the $2 million towards these reserves that we want to build. What we're putting aside for reserves right here, even if we went 10%, is still not big enough. So we have this $2 million towards growth, towards infrastructure, towards maintaining or managing our growth. So it seems to me that the $2 million is in addition to our budget, and therefore we talk about it in terms of if we want to build those reserves or attack certain infrastructure projects in the short term. So I agree with all your sentiments. The only spot I disagree with is that I feel like it's a separate conversation from this budget, because this is a year over year process that we're looking at, and our numbers should be looked at in a year over year way. So that's the only part that I'm differing from you on.
Well, I think what we have to do is get a consensus of council.
That's what I said. I'd like to hear from the rest of council.
And then
Councillor Ramsden, go ahead.
I want to hear.
So I walk the middle ground between you two. Because I do, at least as far as I understand how the budget process works, I do think that $2 million at one point should be considered in our budget. I mean, but I think it represents an opportunity. Like we can build our reserves right now. I mean, if we did go with the 7% increase, we can build our reserves. And so I would almost think that the $2 million, maybe that's a conversation. That's a conversation for the next budget. And then that gives us time to, like you were saying, we'll have our strategic priorities meeting. And because I do think it's such an opportunity, because we consider it as a $2 million windfall. And, yes, all of us have probably spent 4 times over in our head. And so just having that opportunity to sit down as a group, to really flesh out our priorities. And then we've got that $2 million, which maybe we don't actually end up spending next year, but we go, okay, well, here are our priorities. And now we have these $2 million that we can then look at in the next budget. What I'm hearing from this is that an issue in this community that has been that historically we've had quite low tax rates, which has meant that we're now in this position where, we have underfunded reserves. We're trying to build those up. So, I mean, if we can, an increase to taxpayers doesn't make anybody happy. It's never a fun thing to do. But if we can increase it this year so that it means the pain is not as much down the road, and then use that $2 million, later this year, or figure out how we're going to allocate that later this year, then maybe that's rather than doing it right now. Just seems, because $2 million is a lot, and we don't need.
Councillor Engel.
Yeah, I appreciate what Thomas said at the beginning about sort of shifting the thinking from keeping taxes low to keeping assets healthy. And I agree that it's not Christmas every year, and that kind of thinking just needs to be embedded within the budget. And the $2 million I feel needs to be discussed separately and kept separate. And it is an amazing opportunity, but the budget I feel is separate. And because we've been so fortunate to have such low taxes, it is, as Elizabeth said, it's ripping the Band-Aid off at some point. And I feel that if we focus just on keeping our assets healthy and not assuming we're going to have $2 million additional dollars, we need to just focus on the budget and keep that part separate. Yeah.
That's Helmer.
Yeah, I think I agree with what Councillor Nightingale just said there. I think the way I'm looking at it is with this table that's up, there's almost just a fourth line in there. And that is this fund, and it just travels alongside, regardless of whether it's a 7, 8, 9 or 10% increase. It travels along the bottom and goes with the budget. Because I think we do have to keep it a little bit separate back to the original conversation where we are looking at keeping our assets healthy, and we have historically underfunded our reserves, and we are seeing that in our existing infrastructure challenges. And I think at some point we do really have to embrace that and have the conversation, and it does come back to the service levels that we've agreed to deliver. And I think until we change those service level expectations, or the community says we don't want that level of service, then yeah, I think we have to look at keeping that 2 million outside of this discussion, but still with the discussion. In that I don't think it should impact our decision around 7, 8, 9 or 10%. It should just be running with the budget.
Did you, I saw something.
Yeah, I would highlight, thank you everyone for the input. I think where we left off last time was a lot of the discussion and dedicating this was to kind of be informed and discussed in a little more depth in the future. I would highlight as part of the 5-year plan, there are some assumptions that there is provincial funding for some of the existing capital plan, the existing priorities chart, and I haven't heard from council that changing significantly, meaning I haven't introduced new initiatives for another $2 million. The implication of that also is in the 5-year plan, I did not increase borrowing or deplete reserves at a faster rate to accommodate some of those projects. Example, the $8.6 million proposed upgrade to the water treatment facility. There's approximately $1.6 million borrowing requirement, and maybe an opportunity to discuss allocating some of these funds in combination with gas tax or so forth, but that's embedded in the provincial line of your 5-year plan. Meaning, I just want to be clear in highlighting this to council, I haven't gone and added another $2 million. I haven't heard from council. We want to go look at another $2 million of additional scope to go spend that on. I would also highlight there are a few restrictions to that fund, and as far as I can understand, we did just receive it, but I don't believe we can support or reduce operational expenses, i.e. lower tax rates with this fund. This is dedicated to some of the initiatives with infrastructure and supporting that. And I don't know if council had the opportunity yet to have the discussion about the potential opportunity to support delivering some of the existing projects and backlog with a position or half a year, perhaps this year, with respect to operations project, FT or worker to help deliver some of that very infrastructure, which would qualify in terms of this grant. That might be something that council wants to consider. And there's a provision in here which can be removed. There's no net impact to taxes, whether that's included. But I did want to have that discussion or input if it hadn't happened already.
Yeah, no, we have not had that discussion yet, and I appreciate you bringing that up in light of this conversation. You know, in particular, you know, we certainly have a theme here, a concern around the the speed of delivery of projects in the organization. And while we don't have 100% control of that all the time, one of the things that we may be able to attempt to have more control over going forward would be the fact that this is the largest cost that we bear as an organization. And Thomas and I looking across the upcoming capital projects, those that are existing, those have been tabled for a while. The backlog is significant, and I have spoken to council about that from time to time. And it is my feeling that if there is any gap that we could fill that would help us with the progression of that, which would take some pressure off these capital projects being run off the corner of someone's desk, i.e. Tom, who's one of the busier managers that we have in the organization with all of the moving parts of infrastructure, operations, and parks. It would be to add a project manager / engineer to the operations department in order to help facilitate moving these projects forward in a more expeditious way, and hopefully help us to pare down the backlog we have, as well as reduce the ongoing costs that we seem to carry over year by effectively not finishing. So that is a proposal that I would ask council would entertain in this budget.
I just want to ask, is the 2.2 in this budget at all?
It would be embedded in the provincial line, yes.
Under the accounts receivable under.
Well, if you look at the 5-year plan, appendix D,
Yeah.
In the revenues, it's provincial funding, yes.
So it's included in.
And then the other caveat, which I highlighted earlier, is there are some assumptions about forward-looking funding. We've tend to be successful with grants and some of the capital projects. Moving forward, they'd be predicated on receiving funding. So those assumptions would similarly be.
So you're showing that in there, and then I see underneath there under expenses, we're kind of running it out.
Yeah, you have capital expenditures, which would be part of the 5-year plan, which we would review if you.
So that's where that gets used up.
Yeah, and as an example, say we're looking at the water treatment facility. So suppose we're successful in the grant funding, I believe it's over $6 million. There would be a requirement for the village to fund $1.6 million of that. That might be the type of funding the council might wish to direct us to proceed with to use that funding for a portion of that, as opposed to say borrowing at the current interest rates in full, or depleting reserves balances, some of balances, and then supplementing as well. These are the sort of things, but the assumptions in there are that some of the provincial funding would be could be allocated. Yeah.
Thank you.
So any thoughts on, go ahead, Councilor Helmer.
Yeah, just my initial thought on adding more FTEs right now. I wonder if it sends a message that, you know, we're able and we're well funded to deliver projects. And I would argue that the reality is that we're not. And that's why we are indeed in this situation where, you know, we're struggling to provide the existing service level, let alone adding and increase service level. And I may be making an incorrect sort of assumption there that if we add a staff to operations, you know, we're saying, let's do this, when in fact, we probably need to have a more serious discussion around, and maybe this comes out in our strategic conversations, but, you know, what are we capable of delivering on right now, given the population in Pemberton, given the projected growth, and given the challenges we're having today around really wrapping our minds around a significant tax increase just to pay for what we're offering today. So I just, that is a flag that goes up in me for sure around a discussion of adding another staff member in that realm. I am concerned about what kind of messaging that sends.
Can I ask for clarity? Is the role for general operations, or would it be like a project manager to advance that we haven't been able to do?
It would help us advance the existing projects that are laying in wait.
Like examples?
examples being like the amenity building at Dendalf. Another would be assistance with the daycare project, which is being run off the side of Sheena and Scott's desk. And so
Park and ride.
a park and ride, multimodal. So having someone not only with the skill set to be able to do reviews of the engineering specifications and assessments that come through, but being able to then go on site and directly manage any of the operational aspects of the implementation of those capital projects.
Right?
In the past, have we not done that through our engineering company as a consultant? They've managed. a couple of
Yeah,
projects.
well, the tricky part is the deliverables, the assessments come in from the engineers that we work with, and we're not always able to respond to those or assimilate them into the projects as quickly as possible. So, and again, this is based on the amount of backlog that we have of existing projects. It's based on the amount of capital that we're putting towards these projects. So obviously, they're hugely important. I'm at this juncture just talking about what is existing, although I am anticipating that there will be more along with the growth that we're seeing. The other, component of this is that literally these are things that Tom is running off the corner of his desk, and though he does a really marvelous job of it, I often hear frequently from council concerns around when these projects will be delivered on. So it really helps us to move these along. And certainly, I would highlight that it's a liability, longer time periods that go on between, say, the receipt of a significant grant to when the actual projects are able to be actioned. There are cost implications that go with that. Sometimes within the timeframes that we're able to deliver, but honestly, in my initial assessment of the organization, stepping back and seeing what the biggest sticky points are within the organization, this is certainly one of the major gaps.
I mean, it's, yeah. Sorry. What's up?
Well, I was just gonna say, because then our strategic priority planning, that coming up, is that in May or June? June. So I'm just wondering, because what I heard from around the table is saying that this is a conversation about that $2 million, and what we're going to do is a conversation that is going to happen kind of at a later time than what we're talking about now. So maybe this, like the discussion that we're getting into now, should we schedule, I don't know, add it to an agenda for a meeting or schedule a meeting specifically to discuss this around the same time that we do the strategic priority? Because I feel like that would be a great time, because then we will have, council will have a chance to sit down. We've got our project priorities, and then also hearing all of this information from staff. And sort out what we want to do.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. I'm personally quite keen to support this, because I've watched staff struggle to deliver on the grants and projects that we've been successful on, and it's no fault of staff, as we know. It's just too much going on, and the amenities building's been out there for a couple of years. Transit hub, if we can't get through this year and it has to go for an extra year, that the cost increase alone will be twice as much as any wages we put towards project management if we can't get it done. I want to see some of these priorities taken care of. I feel badly for this council. You guys have walked into so many projects on the table. There's no ability to really introduce new ideas and thoughts and projects. So until we move these things along, we're going to, just kind of inch our way forward. So that, for me personally, I to take 50,000 out of that 2 million to put that towards project management, I think that's well placed. That's my personal thought. I'm also, if council feels that this belongs as part of a different conversation, then we could do that as well. Councilor Nightingale, go ahead.
There we go. Thank you. I do feel it's part of a much bigger conversation, but you just threw the number out of 50,000, and I do feel that I'm just thinking about the money that was allocated to the replacement of the boardwalk, which Mr. Seisma I did ask in a previous meeting whether it was safe. He did say it was safe, and I'm wondering if that money could be better spent this year rather than adding a project, and a project that it's okay for people to be on. It will need replacing, but perhaps the $2 million, once we have that discussion, potentially could go towards something like replacing the boardwalk. And if it's a priority to hire a project manager, maybe that money would be better spent there.
Seems to be that through this conversation we're needing to have that meeting not in June, but last week. And I'm wondering, is there any chance that that could be moved ahead into May, because everybody's going around the table with the same ideas? We've got a lot of conversation to have here, whether it's new FTEs or the $2 million or past project that you've mentioned, which I all agree with. But come June, then we're off in August, part of September. There's very little time to make decisions.
As I mentioned before, though, the intent of holding this within that time period, number one, it's logistical, it's availability and such. So we're working on many different schedules that we're trying to bring together to make this happen. We also would like to lay the foundation for discussions around reconciliation and under before going into that more visionary planning session, but really that it puts us in a position for that 2024 budget planning. It is very much the case that with this current budget, that it's much like I spoke about the last time we met, that we are in one of those in-between scenarios where council, and Mike said it in this meeting, has inherited the work of previous council, and that some of the year of 2023 or 2023 really is about carrying on with the projects and many of the service levels that have been implemented or directed by previous council. But that June planning session then creates opportunity for this council to come together with the team to be able to put its imprint on the plan for the next 4 years, or 3.5 effectively.
So how about we do this, because we're a little bit all over the map now. I think everything that's been brought up is really, really important and needs to be broken down, obviously, some of it in its own space. So I think that it sounds like capacity allows for us to have that visioning and strat planning next step in June. We can look forward to that. We certainly don't have to rush to spend our $2 million when we talk about Thomas's example of maybe using for Borrowing instead of Borrowing. Those are decisions that are going to get made down the road anyway. So we do have a little time to work on that $2 million. I heard from most of council that should be considered on its own. So I don't think we have to hurry up and rush. We could have our June session. We could then follow up looking at our $2 million. I'm just trying to bring us back to what's on the screen here and the decisions that we got to make today. I don't know that getting into discussing transferring $50,000 out of the boardwalk to an FTE and then 50,000 out of here to there is going to get us where we need to go today. So yeah, again, I'm trying to bring us back to what's on the screen. Our operation budget, our general budget captures the projects and priorities that we've laid out through all our budget sessions. At a 0% increase, we're looking at a taxation increase to build our reserves towards all these initiatives that are on our minds. Where do we want to go with that? What do we want to see staff bring back in the next budget for a taxation implication? And again, I'm really not trying to rush it. Like we have to go back on some of the details. I'm okay. I'm just trying to get us back on the benefit. Right.
As to Mrs. Corr, what have you written down that you need to bring back to that may change these numbers? Anything at all?
I don't think, given where we are with the offsets with year end and any adjustments, I don't think there's anything that would change significantly in the figures that you're seeing here.
Okay, so you feeling the final audited will be pretty close to what you're projecting right now, so there won't be a $20,000 or $30,000 change at all?
I don't think there's anything material that would require us to change the figures that we're bringing forward here.
So if we were to throw out a suggestion on a percentage change, we would feel comfortable being at that level without any changes coming back to us at the next meeting?
Yes,
Yeah, and just to help you out, and if there was, to your point, if there are some changes, we make a suggestion and go with the direction, if there are some changes, we can make that adjustment next meeting if he comes back with any significant.
And I just want to know that.
Yeah, no, that's.
Do you want us to throw it?
I think we're at that point because to your first question, we haven't directed staff to make any significant changes to the budget. We're at the base level. So I think it's time for us to discuss what percentage increase we want us to include.
I would feel comfortable at 8%.
Speak to it all or?
No, I think the conversation has cleared that all up.
If you want to put that in the form of a motion or just throw open for
I
conversation.
should go around, that's all, debate 8, 6, 9, 10.
Yeah, so the suggestion here is that we go with an 8% increase. Which as being presented would be going towards. The reserve. Got a new hand in Councilor Nightingale?
Sorry, you're just cutting out. I didn't quite hear what you guys do.
Is that we haven't, the committee hasn't asked for any significant changes from staff to the budget. So with that in mind, Councilor Craddock has opened the taxation conversation with a proposal for an 8% increase for discussion. And I'm looking to the rest of you to weigh in.
I'll second it.
I told you it's a motion. Anybody want to speak to it? Go ahead.
I would agree with the 8%, I think is what I would be comfortable with.
Councilor Nightingale?
Am I allowed to ask, Thomas, how, in your professional opinion, and based on all the information, is that something that sits well with you?
yeah, I would say so. I think it takes a balanced approach to that forward-looking plan. I think it's cognizant of affordability to taxpayers. That's everyone else's job around the table, but I think observationally it does that, and it also helps prioritize a lot of the recommendations that have been made in past and by consultants as well to align with those recommendations.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm comfortable with the 8. I think that's the minimum we should be going because we don't recognize the struggle. We're trying to find that balance between planning for the future and affordability. And I think that's a good spot to start. So I will support that motion. Call the question. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Just for clarity, that's a recommendation to council and it'll come forward on the 25th under rising just before.
And as a formality, just so that I've done this right, because I think we did it last year, is council comfortable if what staff has proposed to increase the sewer reserve contribution by 40,000 to 240,000 as well? Does that?
Yep, let's get a motion to that effect. Councillor Craddock, seconded by Councillor Ramsden. Recommendation to council. Any opposed? Motion carries. And do you need any other?
I think that's all for today.
That's it.
Excellent job.
Thank you again, Thomas. Every time we go through this, it's a huge process, and yeah, I wanted to acknowledge that Thomas is the bright face in front of us, but the soldiers behind the scene there, and Arlene and Shar and Jeanette are doing amazing work every day to get us to this point. So they're the unseen heroes behind all this.
Please, I will. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Thomas.
You think 5-minute break?
Sure, I gotta leave,
You have to go.
I gotta leave at 4,
Well, let's keep going. I'll just grab a quick here.
Yeah, we got, let's take a couple minutes, we got a family to join us anyway, so I think we can recess. Yeah.
No.
Okay. Meeting back to order, and we're on 5.1, which is the bullying, harassment and discrimination policy. Good afternoon, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. Today I'm bringing back the Village of Pemberton bullying, harassment and discrimination policy. So last year we actually brought this policy back for review. We hadn't really updated it in a little while. It is a policy that's been around since 2001, and it's had several kind of iterations over the years. Last year, we made a couple of different adjustments to it, and as part of that review process, we agreed that it would be appropriate to bring it back into this forum on an annual basis, primarily as a bit of a refresher, but also as an opportunity for us to make sure that it stays relevant and that we can update it in a kind of proactive way. A little bit of background for those of you that weren't with us last year. Some of the edits that we made included a bit of an adjustment to the scope of the policy. Historically, it has been a policy that was exclusive to kind of staff on staff, bullying, harassment, discrimination issues. We tried to widen that a little bit last year so that it would actually also include, as an example, I guess, if we had a member of the public coming in and harassing a member of our staff, it just gave us a little bit more flexibility to try and address that within different kinds of mechanisms. We also made a couple of edits as well in terms of introducing Indigenous identity into a protected characteristic that could be discriminated against. We also looked at other items in terms of reviewing the responsibilities of staff, VRP leadership and council members in terms of just kind of their roles in maintaining this particular policy and ensuring that we're not seeing kind of bullying, harassment, discrimination behaviours in the spaces that we operate within. And we also included a couple of other tweaks in there too, just in terms of some of the language that we use and some examples of where bullying or harassment may not be deemed to be the case. So for example, giving a list of things like two individuals expressing a difference of opinion, that doesn't necessarily amount to bullying or harassment or discrimination. Obviously, there are different elements that you take into account there, but just to provide a bit more flavor for individuals that might be reviewing this policy and trying to help them determine whether or not it is something that they should be pursuing. As I said at the beginning, the purpose of bringing this back for review on an annual basis is really just to ensure that it stays familiar within this group. We'll also be planning to take it back to a staff update when we have one of those in May, so that it's something that we can refresh our staff and management team on as well. I don't know if anyone's had the opportunity to review it, but I'm obviously open to any more comments and feedback at this stage. I know that we've got a lot of work happening at the moment on a code of conduct, and I'm sure that we can probably streamline some items there, and potentially in the update next year we might include some terminology that kind of link the two documents together. But at the moment I haven't proposed any further updates for 2023.
Thank you very much. I was wondering how it, thank you for saying that, how it tied to the code of conduct work that was. Any questions or comments? Let's go.
And that was where I was going also. I think Mayor Richmond is, can these all be tied together as one? Because I did read through it, both of them actually, and the Squamish and everybody else's little thing. So
Squamish one's really good.
yeah, but yeah, so it would be nice if we could at some point in time, and it's a lot of work to kind of amalgamate them. Would that be the word?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to say I haven't been super familiar with where we are with the code of conduct stream of work. I would, my personal standpoint is, typically there is always a standalone bullying, harassment, discrimination policy, but that it would just be referenced potentially within a code of conduct. So that's where I would see the amalgamation potentially happening. And for sure, we'd love to bring that back forward in the 2024 review, I would suggest.
Super.
If I may, the current code of conduct that the village has references the harassment policy as it was previously. So the two have been connected going back to 2007. when the original code of conduct was approved. So we will be carrying that forward.
Gotcha. Any other thoughts or comments? Seeing none, would somebody like to make the motion that the annual review of the bullying, harassment, and discrimination policy be completed? Moved by Councillor Scott, second by Councillor Helmer. Any opposed? Motion carries. Which leads us naturally right into the code of conduct review.
That's me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Look at that, he's right on the job.
Yeah. Perfect. Oh.
It's here. You're getting set up. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I am going to just sort of do a bit of an overview of the code of conduct review, which we are required to do as per legislation, which changed last year. And I have provided a report. What I thought I would do is just sort of put a little bit of detail or quickly go through the report and touch on some key pieces when we're talking about a code of conduct review. So I just do these. Okay. So first of all, we're going to touch on the background around code of conduct. I will talk about the principles for code of conduct regulations, the Village Pemberton Code of Conduct, and what is a code of conduct, principles and values, setting standards of conduct, establishing an enforcement mechanism, and incorporation of other policies, which we just touched on earlier. So I mean, we could spend hours and hours and hours on this. There was a whole committee that was created that spent 4 years on this. So I'm really going to fly out at a very high level at this point. But to start with, the Village of Pemberton established a code of conduct in 2007. We were a bit unique at the time. Not a lot of communities did have a code of conduct, and it was amended in 2011. Unfortunately, although as alluded to in my report, the code of conduct is provided to new council and it is incorporated into staff onboarding. There hasn't been a lot of work at looking at it or utilizing it over the years, and it's just one of these standing documents that we have that kind of cross references with other policies. In 2016, a resolution was passed at UBCM, which resulted in the establishment of the Working Group on Responsible Conduct. And this was part of a whole really broad conversation around the conduct of elected officials and staff and the relationship between everybody. And over a 3-year period, a lot of work was done by the committee, which concluded researching how people approach code conducts, and then information that people felt were important to have in that code of conduct. There was surveys conducted, and there's a sort of a number of things that came out of it, but a lot of those things came around to, you know, what words are best used in a code of conduct, what are the guiding principles, and how do we and are there enforcement mechanisms? Because a lot of code of conducts don't actually talk about, well, they say this is how you should behave, but they don't really talk about what happens if you don't behave that way and what mechanisms are in place. So all of that resulted in the Municipal Affairs Statutes Amendment Act in November of 2021. And that included the incorporation into the community charter, the code of conduct under Part 4. And what that set out was that within 6 months after its first regular council meeting following a general election, council must decide whether to establish a code of conduct if you don't have one. And if a code of conduct exists, then it needs to be reviewed. And then before making decisions under the above or the review, council must consider the prescribed principles of code of conduct. We'll get into that a little bit. Consider others prescribed matters, things that they would like to see in their code, and comply with the prescribed requirements. And then finally, if you decide not to, if the council decides not to establish a code of conduct or review their existing code, they must make to the public available a statement outlining the reasons why they didn't do that. And in some communities, it may be that they've got a perfectly good one that they've been working with and it's been updated and there's no need for them to really go much further in terms of updating it. So this is the new legislation. We are right in under the gun. Our first council meeting was November 1st, and so May 1st is by the timeline by which we need to review, and we are not the only community that's in that same boat. So that's the legislation. What's interesting is that they put this accompanying principles of the code of conduct regulation, which accompanies the actual legislation. And in that, when a council is considering making a decision under doing a new code or reviewing code, they must look at certain things. And these are the principles that have been set out. The council members must carry out their duties with integrity. They must be accountable. They must be respectful, and they must demonstrate leadership and collaboration. So those are the key 4 principles that through the working group and the legislation and all of the sort of background documents that have been identified as core to a code of conduct. And then you can sort of come around and talk about what is a code of conduct. Well, it's a written document. It may be policy, it may be bylaw, and different municipalities have done it in different ways. And it really sets out the shared expectations for conduct and behavior. And then along with that goes responsible conduct by elected officials. And that part refers to how elected officials conduct themselves with colleagues, staff, and the public. The guiding documents indicate that I recommend that this is not an optional element and that it is key for good governance. So these are sort of the things that that they have recommended, that the working group and the guides that have been developed, these sort of lenses that you think these things through. They also talk about the principles and the values, and as talked about earlier, the key foundational principles as established in the regulation are integrity, respect, accountability, leadership, and collaboration. But the guidelines indicate that you can add more, you can incorporate more into your code of conduct depending on what an organization feels is important around their values and what principles are important to them. And I just did a quick sort of Google search, and some other words that came up around what have been incorporated into different codes of conducts is language around openness or impartiality, transparency, honesty, confidentiality, professionalism. Some of these things are pretty basic and sort of understood, but I think some organizations have felt that for whatever reason, they needed to go a little bit further and add these kind of words and this kind of language into their code of conduct. So when developing the code of conduct based on the legislation, you're not just stuck with the 4 foundational principles. There may be, as a result of conversation, council feels that they need to put more words in there, and that's certainly encouraged through this process. There's also organizational values that are important to be incorporated into a code of conduct, and they should be articulated. What they recommend is that they're articulated through a value statement. And I've pulled some examples of we practice high standards of ethical behavior. We conduct our decision-making in an open and transparent way to inspire trust. We strive for continuous improvement. Our current code of conduct has one statement in it, and it basically says we aspire to the highest standards of public service integrity, which could encapsulate all of these other things. But as we move forward and talk about strategic planning and our strategic pillars and all of these kind of things, this is where you can start to align your code of conduct in with what your overall vision is for the organization, and pull in some of these different things that can help build on your code of conduct. The key thing is to use use clear and concise language so it's easily understood, because as soon as it starts to get complicated and people aren't clear on what a word means or what a statement means, then it can start to muddy the waters in terms of how an organization operates. So the village actually does have values. Village values, I think that's what we called it. And we went through a process many years ago with staff and council and sat down and created this value document. And I think I'm the only person who knows about it or even refers to it. So it's one of those things that has been lost over time, unfortunately. So setting a standard of code of conduct, again, the guide talks about that the foundation, the conduct should reflect 4 key foundational principles. And I pulled out some language from the guiding document that sort of helps people sort of build how you want to do it. Just as a couple of examples, like for integrity, members will be open and truthful. Under respect, members will create an environment of trust, including displaying awareness and sensitivity on language. Accountability, members will listen to and consider the opinions and needs of the community in all decision making. Leadership and collaboration, members will foster a positive working relationship between elected officials, staff, and the public. So the guiding documents have 3 or 4 statements under each one of these foundational principles. I just pulled some examples to give you a sort of flavor of what we might be able to, as an organization and as council, pull together and incorporate in. These may not be anything that council feels are relevant, or they may think these are perfectly good statements, let's carry on and utilize them in our own document. So that is the nice thing about the guide, is it's given you some really great guiding language to use as a starting point. Further on, it talks about customizing and adding other standards or expanding on the ones that have been sort of provided as a guide. And they could, and that could include statements around expected behavior, which might be where you're encouraged, council members and staff, whoever the code applies to, under the code to listen courteously and attentively. Members should always consider the impact of the choice of their language. And then they suggest there's opportunity to sort of identify language or behavior that is discouraged, so that it's written out and clear, and people have a good understanding of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of how you the language that you use and how you conduct yourself at the council table or otherwise. So the other part of this, it takes the code of conduct a little bit further than what has been traditionally put on the table, and certainly from what the village currently has, is establishing an enforcement mechanism. And different organizations have done this differently. The process, but ultimately the process must be fair and impartial. And again, the guiding documents give opportunity or examples of, or ask questions about what considerations should be given to, like what measures do we have in place for continuous improvement at the council table to foster responsible conduct, maintain good governance, and resolve conflicts. What conduct issues can be resolved through information resolutions, and what types of issues should be resolved through a more formal process. How can a fair complaint process that is acceptable and manageable be established? Who can file a breach of code complaint? How will they be investigated impartially? and what experts might be needed to be brought to the table. There might be a need to bring in a facilitator or a human resources expert or a lawyer or whatever, depending on what groups or what is decided and what the significance of the breach. And then what sanctions can and cannot be included in the code. For instance, does that mean that you can't sit at the council table, or you don't get your remuneration for a period of time, or whatever that might look like? And different communities have done it differently. There's, I think it's the example that I put in here, Summerland. They actually sort of said, if you've got a complaint, go to the CAO and the mayor, and they'll figure it out. Yeah, that's a little loosey-goosey. It kind of leaves a lot up to interpretation, and the poor mayor and CAO are now having to sort of figure out how they're going to move this complaint or concern forward, because there's no guidelines provided in their policy on how that might look. Similar to our bullying, harassment, and discrimination policy, we now set out, when I first wrote that in 2001, it was just write a policy so that we know what kind of behaviors are acceptable or not acceptable. And then over time, as legislation's changed, WorkSafe and all of the rest of that has come into play, there's mechanisms on how you address it and the processes and procedures you follow. So what they're recommending as we go through this process is that these processes and procedures are incorporated into your policy or your bylaw. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, what we discussed earlier is incorporating other policies into and referencing those policies into the code of conduct. And by having them as reference documents, and I think Ms. White's point that sometimes these things are kind of different, and you need to have your process for your bullying, harassment, discrimination policy. There might be two sort of enforcement processes, but that policy for bullying, harassment, discrimination follows sort of a WorkSafe operational, how you do things, and it may not, to incorporate it fully into the code of conduct, the processes would be potentially different. But it also talks about implementing or suggesting bringing in your communications policy and your social media policy and gifts and benefits policies and that kind of thing. The two examples I gave here are the sanctions are tied to the remuneration policy, the council remuneration and benefits policy or bylaws that Squamish and Nanaimo have in place. And so what they did is they created the bylaw for the code of conduct, and then they said if there are sanctions and it goes to the extreme where a council member has overstepped, then here's what would happen in terms of their remuneration or their benefits, and that would be their sanction. So there's a lot of interweaving, and that's something that we can do, or it's something that we don't necessarily need to, but it is recommended that you look to, build your code of conduct, utilizing what you've already got and then building on that. So through all of that, we could go through a whole lot of examples, and if the committee wanted to spend some time doing that, we could. I did provide 3 examples, 2 bylaws, 1 policy as ideas of how to proceed. Generally speaking, Squamish Code of Conduct bylaw is the one to follow. It's in all the research, you see it referenced in every report, and they've done a lot of hard work, and in some cases it's quite handy to let the bigger organizations that have more resources do the work, and we can pony up on the work and ride the coattails. So from a staff perspective, what we're recommending as a council or the committee of the whole consider preparing an update and actually bringing forward a code of conduct bylaw for consideration, so that we can incorporate all of the good stuff that people before us have managed to build, and then have an opportunity to have that conversation at a future committee of the whole meeting. So that's my quick and dirty.
Awesome. Questions, comments?
Just a comment, I spent quite a bit of time going over the examples you sent in the Squamish one is exceptional. There's a couple of questions I had in there, but in my own mind, I think I've kind of sorted them out, but it's, it was really refreshing to see it there, and if we can take a template without a whole bunch of staff time.
They happily shared it with everybody.
And they're quite good with that, so
Yeah.
it'd be nice if we could do it without a whole bunch more words. Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, and I'd say the same thing. I think Squamish did a great job and it's a good, it's definitely a good template for staff to work off. So I support the recommendation that, that's in front of us for sure.
Sure, thank you.
So the motion is that the committee recommend to council that staff be directed to prepare an updated code of conduct for review by the committee of the whole at a future meeting. You know, using some of the other examples out there. Moved by Councillor Caddick, seconded by everybody. Councillor Nightingale, did you have a comment as well, Councillor Nightingale? Go ahead. No. Any further discussion? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Gina.
Thank you very much. An interesting project.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conference, you know, UBCM with all the conventions, especially a couple of years ago. There are some very colorful examples of where this came from, why this came about.
Pens
Like,
and stuff, people said.
Yeah, we get thanks for the memo, but that's, yeah, that's, yeah, it's good. If there's nothing else, I'll look for a motion to adjourn the committee of the whole, moved by Councillor Absent, seconded by Councillor Caddick. Any opposed? We're adjourned. Thanks for joining us. Katrina, say
Thanks,
hi to them,
everybody.
please.
Thanks, everybody.
See
Bye.
you later.
Enjoy skiing.